it should be. Thou mayst go. Be gone to thy well.
I guess you can say I got good.
It's the motherfucking Eagle Double G.
Snoop Dogg.
You know I'm mobbing with the D.R.E.
Demon's Souls, originally launched in 2009, is one of those games that was released at the right moment and the right time. The 7th generation of home consoles, the era of PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, was pretty weird in a way. With greatly increased graphical fidelity in comparison to previous generations, many games started taking bigger than ever before inspiration from movies to create cinematic experiences, in an attempt to catch a larger audience. And this has led to some long-running series starting to lose their identity, or new ones appearing without one, because rather than broadening the appeal through accessibility and careful iteration, they would follow the route of homogenization and simplification. Now, I'm not saying that these changes automatically make games worse, but regardless of their quality and the fact that all games take inspiration from one another, in that particular generation franchises would become less unique. Resident Evil 5 would lead the series to a much more action-focused route than ever before, Brothers in Arms would imbue its immersive tactical gameplay with third-person cover mechanics one would find in Gears of War, and things like quick-time events would become ever so more prominent and popular, sometimes leading to hilariously ridiculous results.
Help! Please! Someone! I'm going to die!
And then Demon's Souls came around. In an era when mainstream games would be increasingly more afraid of carving an identity to not drive players away, Demon's Souls was unapologetically true to itself. The game knew what it wanted to be, and it didn't stray from that direction, not one bit, an antithesis to most blockbuster releases of those days. That's why Demon's Souls became such a phenomenon, to the point that nowadays its principles are pretty synonymous with its developer From Software, alongside inevitable discussions about accessibility and difficulty in video games. Both are topics that we'll touch upon in this video too, as the fairly recent release of the 2020 Demon's Souls remake by Bluepoint for PlayStation 5, which for all intents and purposes is exactly the same game burnishing a new coat of paint and therefore can be considered to be the definitive release, is a perfect opportunity to discuss this classic, and even play it for the first time for people like me who have never owned a PlayStation 3. My name is Stanislav Kostyuk, I am a game designer, and this is my review of Demon's Souls. As with all other videos on my channel, we will dissect the game with the help of my Stasocritic system, the Dark Souls of scoring systems, complex in its setup but fair in results and simple to get once you understand it. Before we begin, I have to mention that there will be a number of gameplay and narrative spoilers throughout the whole video. I try to limit them, but it's difficult to discuss Demon's Souls without those, especially in the first category we shall dissect: design. This is the most important category of Stasocritic with the biggest weight, 4, as the way a game is structured, designed and played is what defines our experience the most. Given how famous any Souls title is for its difficulty factor, one would think that challenge and difficulty should definitely be one of the game's pillars, right? Well, not exactly. Challenge does exist as a means to an end, but the pillars Demon's Souls stands on are accomplishment, progression, knowledge, and community. Accomplishment is the matter of overcoming a situation which at first would lead or almost lead to a failure, and then actually persevering. The simplest example of that is a boss fight. In the first encounter you might die, maybe even several times more, but later on you get back and actually defeat the boss, thus getting that feeling of accomplishment created through the cathartic contrast between failure and success. This is not the only way to create a feeling of accomplishment, but it's the specific road that Demon's Souls chose. This is where the aspect of difficulty comes in. Without challenge, you're unlikely to fail. But also we have to take into account that challenge is not an objective construct. It's the subjective difference between your current skill level and the skill required to overcome the obstacle. And that's the reason why the topic surrounding difficulty is so prominent when it comes to a game like Demon's Souls. Everyone will start at a different skill level, everyone will have different rates at which their skill improves, not to mention varying learning mechanisms, and let's not forget about the existence of accessibility issues that can hinder the whole learning process or outright make certain skill requirements impossible. So even though everybody faces the same challenge, not everyone is on even ground. Sure, if you just try again, eventually your inherent skill will rise to the point required to overcome the challenge naturally. But depending on where you start, that can take a lot of time and potentially become very frustrating. Before discussing if Demon's Souls needs an easy mode though, let's take a look at the other pillars of the game as they actually exist to lend you a skill boost. First, there's progression. Relatively early on in the game, there is an optional side path where you will find a bridge with a very scary looking Red-Eye Knight on the other end of it. Should you engage during that first encounter, most likely you're going to die. However, Demon's Souls features an RPG progression, meaning the character has stats that you can put points into and most weapons are upgradable. This means that eventually this very scary Red-Eye Knight is going to become someone you can defeat in several hits. By taking on easier obstacles, you can get enough souls, which act in this game as both XP points and currency, to help you take on challenges that early on may seem as being too high. Of course, if you know the Red-Eye Knight attack patterns, as well as some gameplay rules like getting behind an enemy lets you backstab them for massive damage, you can try to use that knowledge to take care of the Red-Eye Knight with a character that didn't progress as far. And as long as you're careful, you don't need tons of reflexes to succeed. This is where we get to the next pillar of Demon's Souls, knowledge. And that's probably the most powerful tool that players have. Knowledge makes everything easier. This refers not just to knowing the enemy moves or what attributes to best upgrade for your build, but also situations that involve observation, for example. Of course, it is far more straightforward to notice a boulder at the top of the stairs that is likely to fall on you than the button on the floor that would spring a trap. But in both cases, it's something that you can observe if you are attentive enough and don't rush. And even if you got caught in a trap once, well, now you know what's to come and next time will be better prepared. The most important type of knowledge is of course that of the enemy weaknesses. For example, knowing that fire is especially effective against hoplites will be very useful for dealing with the first boss. Or that magic is good against miners in Stonefang, though if you don't have any spells or magic weapons, a thrusting attack is also an effective way to deal with them. Knowledge provides another boost to your skill level, so overcoming the challenge becomes easier. And while experimentation and personal observations to get that knowledge certainly help, this is where the last pillar comes into play: community. Demon's Souls wants players to share knowledge with one another. In-game, this is done through a message-sharing system, where people can leave hints or other types of encouragement for all other players to see. Alternatively, there could be lies too, you have to be careful about that and use your judgment. But the player community is mostly helpful and will try to let you know where you can find hidden treasures, what are the enemy weaknesses, and many other things that will greatly help with lowering that difference between your current skill and the challenge threshold. And of course, there is the wiki, a treasure trove of knowledge that players all over the world have been meticulously gathering in a single place. Should you choose to look for it, you'll find so much information. And while many franchises have detailed dedicated wikis created by the players, the intense level of community cooperation required to figure out everything in Demon's Souls to then place it in an online encyclopedia just wouldn't have been possible if there had been no high challenge ceiling and if every mechanic, action or event had been spelled out in a crystal clear manner. Which leads us back to the million-dollar question, the conversation that's been happening for years and is likely to be ongoing for many more. Does Demon's Souls need an easy mode? And you actually won't hear an answer to that specific question here, because an absolute yes or no would ignore all the nuance of the issue. Here's the thing, on one hand, if we just add an easy mode that increases efficiency of your stats and decreases enemy health and damage, we're at the danger of creating a chain reaction that would lead to the collapse of entire pillars of the game. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for the notion of nobody should tell us how to play our single-player games. But the whole point of Demon's Souls is that even when we play alone, we aren't actually alone. We see other people facing the same challenges as us, failing or succeeding. We can invade other people's worlds to help or hinder their progress. We can find and leave messages for everyone else to see. The 4 pillars of Demon's Souls can be summarized within a single sentence. The game is about players trying to collectively tackle the same problem. Its community ecosystem and concepts that would lead to dividing the community, like a separate easy mode, would damage the ecosystem. That being said, let's go back to the notion of challenge not being an objective construct, as everybody's skill levels are different. While the pillars of Demon's Souls do have a goal of acting as skill boosters, we're still left with the problem of players' starting point being inherently different. And even with the leverage that the game and the community provides, for a hefty amount of people, that still won't be enough. And addressing those issues won't break Demon's Souls. Even though certain members of the Souls player base like to use "get good" as an answer to anyone trying to discuss the nature of challenge and difficulty in these games, at the end of the day, Demon's Souls is really not about honing your gameplay skills to perfection. It's a game about finding how to make things easier for you. Honing your skills is just one way to make things easier. When I first faced Old King Allant, he kicked my ass and sucked 5 soul levels out of me. While that is certainly a questionable mechanic, the next time I faced Allant, I had only 1 level removed and got the boss to 1/4 of his health before dying, learning all of the opponent movesets in the process. Now, I had the knowledge that allowed me to change my strategy, and in 2 attempts I have defeated one of the game's hardest bosses. I knew when to roll during a jump attack, I knew that to avoid getting soul sucked it's enough to just back off, I knew that when Allant prepares a powerful area of effect explosion, it is often best to actually run towards him to strike. But even though I learned all that and improved my fighting skills, what you can also do is don a thief ring that makes you harder to detect and sneakily keep casting poison clouds until you kill Allant steadily but slowly while avoiding the fight altogether. And that's fine. And if you have enough experience to go naked against the same boss while avoiding absolutely all damage, that's also fine. Demon's Souls is all about bridging that gap between your skill and the game's challenge in any way possible, which incidentally is why challenge is not an actual pillar of this game. So whether you do it through skill mastery, careful strategizing, or just shooting the damned monster with a bunch of arrows because you can, is up to you. But that gap must exist for the game's core notions of accomplishment and everything related to community interaction to work. This is why my answer to the Demon's Souls easy mode dilemma is that the game doesn't need an explicit easy difficulty setting so as to not outright remove the challenge threshold. But more options and possibilities to bridge the skill gap I've mentioned are not only welcome, but I would say are required. Among them are accessibility options, of course. While the Demon's Souls remake has introduced options for color blindness and vision impairment, there is nothing that would help players with motor disabilities. Even for controls remapping, the players would have to utilize the PS5 global system settings. Naturally, this significantly decreases the amount of players who would be able to experience a game like Demon's Souls properly. But even outside of that area, Demon's Souls doesn't handle everything in an elegant way, to the point that sometimes you can unknowingly mess up your run with barely a way to fix the situation. When you start the game, you get to create your own character, which includes choosing a body type and a class. Ironically, it is the body type choice that matters long term, as some armor equipment can be worn only by a person of a specific body type. This is not something that will ruin your build or anything, but it still stings to suddenly learn that not all clothes can be worn. A class, on the other hand, is not really something that would define your entire playthrough. It's more of a starting kit, what attributes and equipment you begin the game with. But there's nothing you wouldn't be able to get as you progress further, and you can upgrade your stats any way you desire, regardless of the chosen class. This is a very flexible system that allows for a more systemic approach to creating your builds, and at least when it comes to the core set of attributes, alleviates some pressure from making decisions before you even know what the game is about. Once you start upgrading your attributes though, you've got to be incredibly careful about your choices, as there is absolutely no way to respec your character, neither through paying a certain amount of souls, nor by using an incredibly rare consumable item. As such, it is possible for you to sort of mess up your build with barely a way to fix that, because each level up is accumulative. So to get from soul level 1 to soul level 2, you need 673 souls. To get from soul level 2 to soul level 3, you need 690 souls. Not total souls, but extra souls in addition to the 673 you've paid before. The numbers and differences between each level only get larger from there. This means that some mistaken or experimental attribute level ups in the beginning can lead to a situation where you can't equip a weapon you really need without an additional big investment, with your early level ups transforming into dead weight constantly pulling you down. And if at one point you realize the style of play you chose doesn't entirely fit you, it might be best to consider starting from the beginning, depending on what attributes you have already invested a lot in. And while this may seem like something that fits the unforgiven world of Demon's Souls, it is actually a very uncharacteristic design choice, as the game's brutality is largely a facade. Demon's Souls wants you to think it's an unrelenting experience, a place where you won't achieve anything unless you overcome great odds and prove your worth, where you have to pry success from the game's cold dead body after you destroy it with your skills and wit. But in reality, it's a theater play where you're the main actor and all the means to destroy the game are placed there by Demon's Souls itself. It just doesn't want you to know it. A great example is how the game actually deals with probably the most iconic mechanic it has, losing souls on death. When you are killed, all unspent souls you have gathered remain at the spot of your demise, and if you die again before picking them up, you lose them forever. This mechanic specifically exists to create tension when you die the first time, and a crushing feeling of loss when you die before recovering all your souls. But the result of losing or keeping your souls, for the most part, doesn't matter beyond maybe 1 or 2 extra attributes at best that you'll be able to upgrade earlier if you get the souls back. There are 2 reasons for this. First, Demon's Souls fairly generously places around the maps special soul consumable items. They stay in your inventory forever and transform into souls as a currency only when you use them. Usually that will be right before spending them. There is enough of these spread across the game to get 266,000 souls, which in your first playthrough will get you from soul level 1 to soul level 49. Combine all the souls you receive for killing demon bosses, which will be 275,000 souls more that you probably won't lose because after each boss you're likely to return to your home base immediately to spend them, and with a total of 541,000 souls you'll be able to get yourself to level 63. That's more than enough to create a very potent build capable of completing the game without a single soul from a standard enemy. Those are more like a bonus. Anything you farm between the start of the location and beating the boss won't damage your progression should you lose it. More than that, the scaling of the amount of souls needed for each level up that we have discussed is balanced in such a way that you will get highly diminishing returns for soul farming in the same zone. You will have to keep getting further into more dangerous areas for actual progress. When playing New Game Plus, I once permanently lost more than 150,000 souls, but I didn't even bat an eye, because at that point I knew there's nothing actually particularly punishing in this, even with such a large amount at risk. In a way, this is the beauty of Demon's Souls. It wants you to think that it's tough as nails, but behind the scenes it softens things up and nudges you to move forward. This is actually a reason why, out of all the game's seemingly brutal mechanics but actually not really, losing souls upon death is the one I'm most unsure about in its current form. On one hand, it is arguable that this is the mechanic most responsible for setting up the game's personality and atmosphere, but also this is the mechanic that is most likely to drive players away due to the immense crushing feeling one can get the first time it happens, to the point that even if they are ready to face the challenges ahead, they might not feel like experiencing the feeling of losing souls again, even though there is actually no long-term damage to that fact. I can't say that I see huge disadvantages in making the system friendlier for newcomers in some way. One can say that loosening this up would remove a unique atmospheric aspect of Demon's Souls that I have mentioned. But then again, for years I saw people saying that lack of pause, something that I consider to be a basic need in every game when you're not connected online, is an imperative, unique aspect to the Souls package. The Demon's Souls remake allows you to pause when not playing multiplayer, albeit in an indirect way through photo mode, and I didn't feel that anything was lost with having that capability. And while I'm sure there is some way to keep the atmosphere of Demon's Souls intact while also giving some emotional leeway to newcomers, I'm not here to do theoretical design, as any such attempt without actual playtesting doesn't prove anything. At the end of the day, what matters for analysis is two things. Demon's Souls has a mechanic in place specifically designed to incur a crushing feeling of loss, but also the game gives you resources to ensure that even if you keep losing everything, you'll get enough souls to advance yourself far into the game. And we'll see this sort of principle in many different aspects of Demon's Souls. For example, the very first tutorial area is about giving you a sense of power while teaching the controls. You fight enemies mostly one-on-one, they don't hit hard so you can easily defeat them, and even if you fail you can't actually die while going through those levels. The game literally doesn't let you until a certain point where you're actually supposed to be killed. This area is actually imperative for teaching the basics of Souls action pacing caused by the stamina system. Every action takes up some amount of stamina. Hitting, rolling, running, blocking. You'll be forced to back off and wait until your stamina is restored before continuing. Neither you nor your enemy have the possibility to be unrelentingly quick. Therefore, combat in the game is less about having higher reflexes and more about strategizing, observing, being careful, and also understanding the timings. Not only that with the opponent, but yours as well. Because absolutely every action you do, every attack of every weapon, every spell, every roll, everything has a concrete animation and timing that will never change. Not only does this allow the game to give a proper sense of weight or power to each move as necessary, but also you have absolute consistency. As a player, you know precisely what will happen when you press a button. This is where we circle back to each class being a particular starting kit, and a problem that Demon's Souls has. There is no specific default class. At first I thought it was the Knight, because it's the character featured on the cover and pretty much all the promotional material. But even though the Knight was the first selection when I was creating my two characters I completed the game with, after testing it out more and with several accounts I realized that the default selection is actually sort of random. And that's a problem because when faced with a pretty big list of classes, most newcomers would select whatever is chosen for them as default, and not every class is a good teacher of the game's principles. For example, the Knight, which was the first character I played with. This class creates wrong expectations and can teach faulty principles. I would fall for these myself, and it took completing almost the whole game to actually unlearn those things. The Knight creates the impression that there exists a trade-off between mobility and heavy armor protection. There is no such trade-off. Even in the beginning, the difference is pretty negligible, though due to initially low character stats you can still feel it somewhat. But that difference quickly fades. Your armor efficiency doesn't scale with attributes like your weapons would, there is no way to upgrade it, and since physical defense raises with each level up regardless of what you equip, there is actually no reason to wear heavy armor in the game unless it greatly boosts special resistances like fire or magic, though even those are upgraded by certain attributes. And the only way to learn this fact is to either change what you're wearing to something lighter, which is easy to think of as being dangerous and therefore better to avoid, or finding an even heavier armor set and seeing that it doesn't actually do anything besides making you slower. I would say that lack of armor weight trade-off is definitely an oversight, especially because with heavy armor you sacrifice the mobility of the roll. Probably the most important defensive move in the entire game that not only is effective repositioning, but also features invincibility frames, an important survival aspect. But as a Knight you'll barely try to use it at all, because it's so slow and clunky when you have lots of equipment on, with no other great alternative except the shield they start with. The Knight's starting weapon, the longsword, is great for beginners though, as it is very versatile with a pretty fast, varied and easy to learn moveset. But because it's the knight's only offensive weapon, you are very likely to fully focus on melee style of play, possibly ignoring tried out archery, and most likely ignoring spellcasting. This is not a class for starting players, it better fits people who already know the game. The class that is though is Royalty. They can start with light armor so they can roll effectively. Their starting shield doesn't fully block all physical damage, so you can't just hide behind it and are forced to either dodge, parry or attack. Their starting weapon can only thrust, but it's pretty quick and it's enough to teach about attacking. This setup teaches a more active playstyle, which is important. But most importantly, Royalty class starts with a spell, Soul Arrow, a very effective one too. In general though, magic is considered to be the unofficial easy mode of Demon Souls. It is strong and plenty of enemies are weak against different types of spells, so you can become extremely powerful in a magic-focused playthrough. But here's the thing. You can become extremely powerful in any type of playthrough, and magic is pretty easy only if you know what you're doing. If you just start out and decide to abuse the power of the Soul Arrow, for example, which doesn't actually kill everyone in one hit, then you risk running out of mana quickly as you won't use it effectively. So you have to learn a strategy that would combine magic with melee combat, know when to keep your distance and when to close in. You also need to find and upgrade specific items if you want to increase the effectiveness of your magic spells, and even then you won't instantly become a killing machine. And though with some spells like Firestorm you will be able to literally kill some bosses with one shot, if you stop being careful, they'll be able to easily one-shot you as well. So starting with Royalty is not something that gets rid of the skill gap we have mentioned several times before, and really can't be considered an easy mode as such, but still it can provide a sufficient confidence boost. This class would certainly teach much better how to play the game than starting as a knight, which is best left for players who actually have experience with Demon Souls. The reason I focus on the topic of the starting class so much is because it affects the first user experience a lot. And for the most part, Demon Souls is actually fairly smooth and careful about teaching the principles of the game. We already have mentioned how you can't die in Demon Souls until you reach a certain point in the tutorial. That point is encountering the Vanguard, a tutorial boss that is highly likely to just kill you in one hit. But also, you're supposed to die in this encounter. Not only is it a moment that teaches you to not get too self-confident, as even when you're in a power roll you can die at any moment, but as a result of this death you get to learn some of the more important concepts of the game. First, you get to see the Nexus, which acts as a home base and the connective tissue between all the worlds you will be traveling to. Then, you are incarnated in soul form, which is what happens every time when you die in body form, and you learn that while in this soul form your health is halved. And to regain body form, you need to vanquish a demon boss. This may seem punishing at first, but there is an implicit lesson in this scenario. If you haven't gotten that already, you're encouraged even more to tread carefully and conserve your health. At this point, there is only one world available to you, filled with the weakest enemies in the game that don't hit too hard and will drop quite a bit of healing items. So as long as you have patience and don't rush forward, you will be mostly fine. And while you may not know this at first, being in soul form also protects you from invaders. As part of the online component, people may choose to invade you as Black Phantoms to regain their body by killing, well, you. So the soul form protects you from that aspect. The game ensures that you can't get ganked during your starting experience, especially in case when you're out there trying to reach your bloodstain to recover your souls, so you won't be able to lose them forever because of another player. The design of the first proper level of the game, Gates of Boletaria, is another example of Demon Souls teaching you without putting too much pressure behind the scenes. It has just a single golden path that you have to go through, with some optional side paths that you can follow if you wish. Those optional paths either lead to dead ends or circle back towards where you began, and only 2 of them feature really challenging situations. In both cases, you can see the high danger from afar. This golden path will take you all over the map back to the beginning of the area to open the gate leading to the first boss. And as every time you die you start at the archstone you teleported towards, this configuration helps with reaching the boss fast should you die in combat. But what if you get killed somewhere in the middle of this path before unlocking the gate? Exploration of side paths will actually help you to unlock a shortcut here, allowing you to skip a big chunk of the level you have already been to. If you reach this shortcut, the gates to which you can see in the very beginning of the level, you will find the Cling Ring, an item that raises the health limit in soul form from 50% to 75%. So now that the game has tested you in a setup where you need to be sure to tread carefully, you get more leeway in how you can try to act. This level also promotes experimentation by having the enemies show what you can do. For example, there are soldiers throwing firebombs at you. Well, you get firebombs as part of the loot you collect throughout the level. You also receive pine resin, which sets your weapon temporarily on fire, just like some of the Draglings have. So Demon's Souls really nudges you to try and use these fire-based tools by showcasing their usage. The game has battles that explode either hit with fire, and there are two situations where you can see enemies blowing these battles up, in one case killing themselves in the process. So the next time you see enemies among these kinds of battles, you can try and get rid of them more effectively. Or not, because you might just ignore all the signs, but in the first area I don't hold it against the game, as here Demon's Souls is pretty good with its implicit tutorialization. Not spelling things out explicitly, but nudging you to learn through its loot table and rewarding observation. This observation will help you with the first boss, the Phalanx. If you decide to try and use fire weapons against it, you'll find that it's very effective, or you can read the hint left by other helpful players. But even if you don't have any fire tools with you, Phalanx does not pose a huge reflex test. The boss itself actually doesn't do anything. What makes it tricky is the fact that it's defended by a bunch of hoplites, a type of enemies you would have encountered shortly before reaching Phalanx. By the way, these hoplites were put in pretty narrow spots specifically so you would see that if you try to hit them from the front, you won't do much damage. But if you flank them, then they're easy to kill. Again, implicit tutorialization that rewards thinking and observation. So with the backstabbing strategy you can deal with the first boss even if you don't have any fire-based tools left. But also, if you're careful enough, you can just brute force through everything. And for what it's worth, 70% of people who have played Demon's Souls have defeated the first boss. Which honestly is not a bad statistic, though of course statistics alone aren't an indicator of good design, but you can see where I'm getting at. The starting experience of Demon's Souls is not built to be particularly brutal, and that's considering that you actually can't upgrade your character until you defeat the first boss. So progression doesn't play a role at all in helping to reach this moment. If that had been a possibility, even more people would be able to find ways to reach and defeat Phalanx, which I personally think would have been a great boon for the game. The thinking probably was that before players get the possibility to upgrade their character, they need to complete a trial by fire, but I honestly don't consider that to be necessary. Regardless, beating Phalanx is when the game really opens up. Not only can you upgrade your character, but archstones to all 5 worlds become available. And since you've regained your body form means that you get your full health bar back, alongside the ability to call upon other soul form players to help you as Blue Phantoms, which you can do only in this form. Of course, as I have mentioned before, you can also be invaded by the more aggressive Black Phantom players. This is Demon's Souls' way to do co-op and PvP, and the way you get to join this multiplayer component is very immersive. When a player is in Souls form, they can use a blue stone to leave a sign, which a body form host can interact with to summon the player as a Blue Phantom. After the Blue Phantom helps to kill the boss of the area they're in, they will regain their body form. Similarly, a player in soul form can use a black stone to invade another person's world, and they regain body form if they find and kill the host. The fact that incentive is the same in both cases is pretty disappointing. Yes, if you dig deeper, there can be other motivation that includes things that we haven't talked about yet, like character tendency, but your final reward is pretty much the same regardless. You get your body back alongside extra souls. Having different reasons for joining another world as a Blue or Black Phantom would improve things greatly. This also leads to a problem with finding co-op players in your first run. Because the Blue Phantom gets their main reward only for defeating a boss, you will rarely ever see anybody placing a sign outside of the boss entrance area. There is no incentive for a player to, for example, show the person they're joining different secrets and stuff like this. It can happen, and for example, I myself try to help people out not just with their bosses, but due to the final reward, people are interested mostly in what will bring their body form back. Of course, the situation is different if you have a friend or find somebody to play with specifically, but that's not the standard experience. Also, once New Game Plus kicks in, you'll see more people leaving their signs at the beginning of the area, so you would go through all of it together, but that pretty much never happens in the first run with lower leveled characters. There is also a matter of bosses not being designed for co-op battles. Their AI can't properly handle several players, so in the end they become punching bags. And look, them becoming much more trivial fits with the whole Demon's Souls approach to progress. As mentioned before, it's about finding ways how to make things easier for you, and Calling Blue Phantoms certainly does. But sometimes there is this weird, disappointing feeling when you've beaten a boss not because of some sort of strategy or even a cheesy trick, but because the boss is just too confused due to the amount of players. Now, when it comes to PvP, there is this weird thing that even though the game tries to match players of similar soul levels together, this is still a duel between players in a game balanced around PvE. And one would think that the precise control style of Demon's Souls is perfect for PvP, especially in an online environment with good latency. The problem is, with Demon's Souls being primarily a PvE game, you get access to a lot of healing items. The developers of the remake at Bluepoint have tried to address this by adding a more strict limit to better healing grass, as well as increasing their weight. But the issue still remains. You can regain quite a lot of health during the battle. On the other side of the equation is the fact that you try to build your character to deal with enemies as fast as possible, meaning that you're likely to have ways to hit like a truck not just the AI, but other players as well. This transforms PvP fights into this sort of long stalemate where players keep prodding until someone makes a single mistake and you can stunlock them to oblivion, or otherwise deal a massive amount of damage as quickly as possible before the opponent gets a chance to heal. And in a way, this style of play fits the whole Demon's Souls context, but even when you win it can feel frustrating and unsatisfying. Admittedly, it is fun to set up a trick for the opponent to deal with them effectively, but there are actually not a lot of places where you can do that, so it doesn't change the overall point of basic combat-focused PvP being fairly rudimentary and sometimes frustrating. Especially if you lose as the invaded party in body form. Not because of the losing souls mechanic, which you've established already isn't that big of a deal, especially considering that once you get in soul form you can get invaded by a player, but because of world tendency. Now, even though I have praised Demon's Souls for its implicit tutorialization, as well as not spelling a number of things out too explicitly so players would have reasons to communicate and figure things out together, there are mechanics where even when you see what the game is going for, it is being just too obtuse for its own good. World tendency and character tendency alongside it are but one of the examples. The concept of world tendency is actually pretty interesting. Your actions affect the state of the world around you. Some, like Vanquishing a Demon, bring the world tendency closer to white. Some, like Dying in body form, bring it closer to black. When at white world tendency, the enemies are weaker but also give fewer souls on death, while in black world tendency the situation is the opposite, plus the rarer item drops become more common. Some locations, characters or events happen only when you reach a specific level of white or black tendency. The problem is that this system is really pretty much impossible to understand without reading it up. I can only imagine what effort it took for players to actually find all the rules, as sometimes they don't quite make sense. For example, at the beginning of Boletaria Palace level, there is a gate that opens up only at pure white or pure black world tendency. The first problem with that area is that it looks like you can vault over towards it, but you can't. Since it's designed specifically for pure tendency, you can get there only when the gate opens. Though since I have mentioned this, in general, the inconsistency of objects that you can or can't vault over is very prominent in Demon's Souls. A lot of barricades that look like they can be vaulted over actually can't be, and likewise there are a lot of places where you can vault over, but it looks like you can't. But that's beside the point. If you get back to this particular location I'm talking about, if you explore this area in pure white world tendency, you will find Executioner Miralda, a hostile NPC that will attack you on sight. How killing this unfriendly NPC in self-defense will affect the world tendency, you might ask? Well, as I accidentally discovered by not understanding why the world tendency of Boletarian Palace suddenly became so low, killing Executioner Miralda moves the slider greatly towards black tendency. I did mean world tendency of Boletarian Palace specifically, because each of the 5 worlds you travel to through Archstones have their own world tendency that are affected only by events that happen while you're in each particular world. So whatever you do in Boletarian Palace will not affect Stonefang, for example. And the results of these events can be as obtuse as a wooden bridge appearing in the middle of a level that will allow you to complete a side quest. Not only all of this is needlessly complicated, but also to be absolutely fair, it also feels like not enough things are changing with the world tendency. It's all very localized to specific locations in the world, and unless you go to the menu to check what tendency you have, there would be little to no understanding what world tendency level you're actually in now. Enemies becoming stronger with lower tendency sounds scary, but in reality it usually amounts to them needing one extra hit to die. Besides the world tendency, there's character tendency, which also changes depending on your actions, but not all actions that change world tendency will change your character tendency, and some things that affect your character tendency do not matter for world tendency. These tendency mechanics do work well for a certain degree of role-playing, but they are difficult to get, and at the end of the day the effects are pretty underwhelming. I wouldn't say that's the best combination. I do understand though why Demon's Souls was going for such a system. The game is actually designed around non-linear progression throughout the worlds and revisiting locations, so it was pretty obviously intended for players to notice these things while jumping from world to world and also getting back to some of the areas they have been to already. It doesn't quite work when it comes to world tendency, but the structure of the game itself is sound. As you already know, when you properly begin the game you have access only to Gates of Boletaria, also known as World 1-1. Defeating the boss of that world not only unlocks World 1-2, but also Worlds 2-1 to 5-1. After this you can complete any world in any order, with the only exception being that to get to World 1-3 you must fully complete at least one of the other Archstones. While nothing prevents you from trying to tackle each world in any order, everything is balanced around World 1-1 being the easiest and 1-4 the most difficult, with the rest located at various points in between. The schematic here is only an approximation, the point being that whenever you feel stuck in one place, the best option would be to try and tackle another world, which makes the structure very liberating and in a way empowering, especially when you find strategies to tackle what would normally be a more challenging area. Of course, this structure alone doesn't promote revisiting areas. What does is the fact that many items are dropped only by particular enemies in specific worlds. For example, while you'll find a certain limited amount of healing items everywhere, only in World 1 will you be able to actually get as many as you want by getting back there and killing some enemies. World 3 is perfect for a mage, as there you can get a lot of resources that refill your mana. You get the idea. I can't say I'm a particular fan of such a strict division of loot, but also for the most part it doesn't actually hurt the game. It's worth noting that Demon's Souls tried to go for a little bit of a survival horror vibe by adding a weight limit to your inventory. Whatever doesn't fit you can send to a certain storage character, Stockpile Thomas, in the Nexus. This sending feature, by the way, was added in the remake. In the original you had to keep running to Stockpile Thomas yourself to free up your inventory. This whole inventory burden feature is largely useless though. You can carry too many items for the limit to lead to any sort of interesting choices, and too few for it to not become frustrating. It's just a needless inconvenience, especially considering that the heaviest item stacks, resources used for upgrading weapons, can be used at blacksmiths without actually having them on your person. And that last part was present in the original PlayStation 3 version too. Any resource Stockpile Thomas has will be available for upgrading weapons. And since we have touched upon the topic of weapon upgrades, this is another area where Demon's Souls stumbles somewhat by making things too overly complex without a distinct advantage to that complexity. So, to explain how it works, each weapon has a number of upgrade paths besides the default one. Only one out of the 2 blacksmiths in the game can actually forge those alternative upgrade paths, and you can see those alternatives only if you talk to that specific blacksmith while having your weapon at a certain level of the default upgrade path, which would be different depending on the path in question. Now, you can already see how this can negatively impact discoverability of the existence of alternative upgrade paths in the first place, but really that's a small issue in comparison to the real problem of the weapon upgrade system. There is just too many resources. Every upgrade path requires its own ore type, and every ore type has different levels of quality which is required for different levels of upgrades, ranging from shards to chunks to a pure example of that ore. And you find that ore within the same loot paradigm, meaning that to get the required type of ore you need to farm specific places. And chunks of ore are usually much rarer than shards, and pure ore is even rarer still. To give an example of how frustrating this whole thing can be, I started with a knight and I eventually decided to focus on strength. So after I learned about different upgrade paths, I decided to upgrade my longsword to a crushing path, meaning that the more I upgrade the sword, the better scaling bonus it gets from the strength attribute. Sounds straightforward enough, right? Well, you need Greystone ore for the crushing path upgrade, and it drops only from one very specific type of enemy, rockworms in World 2.2. And while getting Greystone shards is not a problem, I needed Greystone chunks. I literally had more Greystone shards than Stockpile Thomas could store by the time I got 9 chunks I would need to upgrade my sword up to crushing level 5, the maximum one. Meaning I killed hundreds of rockworms, and I didn't have a single drop of pure Greystone from them, and I would need one. Luckily, there is a way to get pure Greystone. If you reach pure white world tendency and do some very specific things in World 2, I'm not gonna go into those details, I had to Google because otherwise there's no way I would learn that inside a boss area specific rubble would get removed, which leads to an item that, if shown to a certain character, gives you pure Greystone. Though from what I hear, getting a pure Bladestone is an even more cumbersome affair. And these overly complicated or too obtuse aspects are particularly striking in comparison to all the situations when Demon's Souls properly incites curiosity with its obtuseness, which is at its best when one questions systems through curiosity. For example, if every NPC in the game can be damaged, does this mean that the flying red dragon can be too? Yes, and you can find a way to do that. That moment when you realize that you came across the lower part of what seemed like a bottomless pit, and now thanks to this observation you question if you can jump from scaffolding to scaffolding and use that pit as a shortcut. The answer is yes. Or that moment when after a rockworm takes so many hits to be killed, you wonder if the mouth where he's not protected by stone is a weak spot. The answer is also yes. This is without mentioning the implicit tutorialization, let alone all the narrative aspects of the game that we're not going to touch at this moment. Demon's Souls deals best with hidden information when it's about more systemic connections that you can see, deduce, and share with others. This is why mechanics like World Tendency, where it's not as much observation of the game's reality but being in a certain place under specific circumstances, don't really work, even if the concept of changing the world with your actions is actually sound. Similarly, there are levels in Demon's Souls that work better when they follow certain principles that the game has set up. For example, the Depraved Chasm is a really disliked map by many. If you compare it to Gates of Boletaria that we have discussed previously, there are multiple reasons for that. First, instead of feeling like an interconnected space, it's essentially a complex corridor with some side paths. There is even barely a shortcut that you can take to reach the boss more effectively. There are some paths available, but they don't save much time. This level is the only one to feature some rats, an annoying little enemy that doesn't really set up or prepare for anything. There's just a number of them in a particular location and they can afflict you with plague, and that's it. It doesn't help that the level design itself consists mostly of narrow paths from which you can pretty easily fall to your death. Compare it to Upper Latria, which has a lot of similar characteristics but is much better designed. There is a lot of narrow paths across bottomless pits, but they're regularly varied with larger platforms that provide more space for movement, as well as wider areas in the central tower and also at the bottom at the swamp. So, first things first, there's variety. The main enemy type in this level are gargoyles, a direct preparation for what's to come in the form of man-eaters, a set of 2 flying bosses. In the swamp you also first encounter centipedes, an enemy type that fills up the rest of the map after you destroy 2 chains in these locations. There is a feeling of progress as well as actual learning happening. And while technically there are no shortcuts towards the boss in this level, the level is structured so that you first have to open your way to the boss by going through a circle this way, and then you don't have to go through this area ever again. From the starting point you can go directly to the boss area. This helps you to form an image of interconnected space in your head, while also essentially marking sort of checkpoints. An additional atmospheric aspect for this level is the fact that many gargoyles try to set up ambushes by either flying really high or posing as immovable statues. It adds a certain degree of paranoia, though there's always ways to know in advance where danger will come from if you're careful and, once again, observative enough. All of these aspects are absent from the Depraved Chasm, which leads us to the biggest reason why that map is disliked. It can actually be punishing. And this is the difference between good Demon's Souls maps and disappointing ones. The good ones are those that may feel brutal or even scary, but actually provide good teaching avenues and plenty of possibilities to make things easier. And I would say there's more hits when it comes to Demon's Souls levels than misses. The same can be said about bosses. But honestly, I'm ready to go easier on bosses that are a miss for one specific reason. Demon's Souls tries to make sure that absolutely every boss encounter is a unique experience. Yes, Dragon God, for example, is a very disappointing boss. The gameplay here consists mostly of hiding behind standing pillars while trying to break the other type of broken pillars to progress. Dragon God noticing you can be inconsistent at times, as such any death in this battle may feel cheap. This is easily one of my least favorite encounters in the entire game. But with that being said, this is also a fight unlike any other. The game tries to put you in a situation where you personally literally cannot do anything against this massive enemy. You have to hide most of the time. So even though it's not the best in terms of design and gameplay, it is still a memorable experience. Flame Lurker is an incredibly aggressive close combat boss fight. He doesn't have a single ranged attack. And that's the only boss fight like this in the game, there is no other. Even the old King Aland, who is also fairly aggressive, has an absolutely different cadence of the fight and moves are not limited to close range. There is even a boss who is actually controlled by another player. And while that comes with all the negative parts of Demon's Souls PvP system, while also including the fact that the invader can actually just leave and you get to fight a pretty uninteresting enemy as a result, still it's the only fight like this in the game. There's only a single boss who creates copies of itself, only a single boss who is blind, only a single boss who destroys different floors you stand on. Some of these bosses are better designed, some of them are worse, but each one is unique. Not just unique in a way of having different combos, movesets and weaknesses, but unique in everything. Bosses in Demon's Souls are not necessarily about testing your core gameplay skills, they're set pieces, one-time memorable moments. So even if I am personally disappointed with the sum of the bosses, it was still great to actually discover what each one is. And there is at least one way to make each boss absolutely trivial to complete, and this is not a flaw. Because at the end of the day, as we have established sometime before, you're the main actor of this theater play, who one way or another has found a tool provided by the game to make it happen. Demon's Souls is not a game about perfecting your skills, it's a game about finding how to make a challenge easy, whichever way you prefer. And I think that's why it has managed to get a reputation of being tough but fair. Even New Game Plus, which scales enemies up to pretty ridiculous levels as everybody can kill in a few hits, is still about that. Being careful, observant, and figuring out how to transform this freaking Black Phantom Mind Flayer into somebody who is not a problem for you at all. All this is why, if you open up the possible scores for design, by the way feel free to pause if you'd like to read them all, I will assign an 8 to Demon's Souls. There are plenty of prominent aspects that stand on pretty shaky ground, ranging from things like world tendency to the design of some levels. But the game has a very solid foundation focused on bringing the community together, consistent core mechanics, a lot of great levels, unique bosses, and most importantly, a correct general approach of handling the challenge ceiling. While at times Demon's Souls is pretty unrefined, what it does elegantly, it does really well. Now it's time to talk about context. This category has a weight of 1 and it's about things that don't necessarily define the experience but greatly enhance it. Plot, player stories, characters, world, etc. When talking about the narrative of Demon's Souls, we have to separate two notions: the style of delivering the story and the quality of the story itself. Demon's Souls doesn't openly provide you with any information other than the basics needed for general understanding of what's going on, as well as effectively setting up your motivation as a player. Everything the game tells you openly can be summarized by one sentence: a part of the world is enveloped in colorless fog that spawns demons, and your goal is to go there and kill those demons. Simple, effective, and potentially really the only thing you can get from the game's narrative, because the rest you have to piece together on your own based on what people say, what you read in item descriptions, fighting environments, and so on. This leads to some very cool moments and theories that you get when you gather up all the information together. For example, in the beginning cutscene it was said that Valorfax, one of the Twin Fangs, managed to escape the fog and wrap in Boletaria to tell everyone of its plight with demons. When you talk to Ostrava, he says it was Bjor who had escaped. However, you meet Bjor at one point in the game, so that information can't be true. But also, near the gates of Boletaria, among the many corpses lying beside the Dragon Nest, you can find the Ring of Great Strength. In the description it says that this ring was bestowed to the Twin Fangs. The only other type of this same ring that you can find is on Bjor's dead body if you or somebody else kills him. The game doesn't explicitly tell you this, but naturally there is an implication that Valorfax died near the Dragon's Nest. And that raises questions. Did he die before or after telling everyone about the problems in Boletaria? In the second case, this would mean that he escaped and then went back and perished. In the first case, could the Valorfax that escaped be actually demonic projection? The game has examples of that happening. This would mean that the demons have devised a plan to actually lure more people to them and gather their souls. And maybe that's why Strava thought it was Bjor who escaped. And the beauty of this all is that the game doesn't provide any concrete answer to this question. This may seem counterintuitive, but Demon's Souls revels in ambiguity, and in the context of the chosen storytelling style, I think that's the right approach. Because what you consider to be the truth will depend entirely on what information you find, be it in the game or when talking to other players. And if you know all the information that was provided, then you have room for theorizing with other people regarding what has happened. This all feeds back into the aspects of discovery and community interaction. Now, on the other end of the coin we have the aspect of how good the actual story is. And here I think Demon's Souls stumbles. While it is interesting to piece things together, the end result is often lacking. The characters are very one-note, each having only one particular characteristic. This person is a coward who left his wife in order to die, this one is a warrior who likes to sleep, this one is an assassin. Despite the game having a tool to add a lot of nuance to characters and their personalities through its storytelling methods, Demon's Souls doesn't take advantage of that, with the exception of some demons like King Galad himself, who woke up the Old One and can be considered the cause of the Demon Scourge. Was it lust for power that motivated him, or his own perception of righteousness that would save the world? Everybody has their own point of view related to this. Another disappointing aspect is that you can't really do anything with information you gather. For example, at one point you can figure out that the Old One is the source of all spells and miracles, and thus is actually the god that people of this world worship. This is a pretty interesting world-building aspect, sure, but learning about it doesn't change how you play or what you do, or even what final choice you make in the game. At the end, you can choose to either lull the Old One back to sleep and get rid of the demon influence and the fog that engulfed all nearby lands, or join the Old One as his new demon servant. And the game never really paints the latter option as something that would be beneficial in any way or form to anybody, even to you as a player if you consider that you are role-playing somebody who seeks power. Because ultimately you see what has happened to the previous servant of the Old One. He became a pathetic, powerless being who needed a fake demonic projection to do everything in his stead. That fate is far from tempting. Even though the most interesting thematic conceit of the entire game is left untouched in terms of narrative. In the context of the game, beings become demons thanks to feeding on the power of the souls. This is what we're literally doing the entire game to upgrade our character, channel the souls into ourselves, which means that the more powerful we are, the more demonic we become. That's why the title is Demon's Souls, not Demon Souls. We are the demon and these souls are ours. But there is nothing within the game that would contextualize this aspect into some meaningful actions from your side. It's information that's just there. It is interesting, it is fascinating, and the act of collecting all of it like a puzzle is satisfying. But also nothing would really change if I just ignore all of that. There is even a question regarding the whole narrative consider the game, whether it was really King Aland who awoke the Old One, or were it the seemingly noble Monumentals who did that and then they hastily tried to find a way to fix their mistakes. This is a very fascinating thought, especially in the context of Demon Souls ambiguity where there can be no right answer. But again, there is really nothing that plays with this part of lore. And there are plenty of actions that you can do which lack any sort of reactions from NPCs. For example, if your character reaches Black Tendency, you can actually get a side quest to kill different people within the Nexus. You can kill right in front of another person and this act won't be recognized at all. And it's disappointing, especially considering that there are gameplay consequences to your actions. For example, by killing these people, you're actually getting rid of different stores or other helpful mechanics. This is why if you open up all scores for context, I will assign a 7 to it. Overall, it is enjoyable to create all the different connections, but Demon's Souls doesn't do enough to make its narrative and the way it's presented transform into something that really matters, and that's disappointing. Now it's time to talk about aesthetics. This is another category with the weight of 1, as it's again about something that enhances the experience but doesn't necessarily define it, this time through visual style, music, sounds, etc. Now, before we talk about aesthetics, I have to mention that this is the area most different between the PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 3 versions, not just in terms of graphical fidelity, but the actual aesthetic aspect. Lighting and mood is different, some areas get a more gothic feel to them that was absent before, the soundtrack also differs in style. And since I will discuss the PS5 version in this video, not everything I say might apply to the original version. Ultimately, which style you like more is a matter of preference, as the differences are quite subtle in a way. I don't think it will make much sense to talk about graphical fidelity in this section. You see the footage in front of you, the huge amount of detail in the maps, the quality of animations, the usage of special effects. So I will talk more about actual aesthetic choices. One thing I really appreciate is how Demon's Souls puts subtle fog in absolutely every outside area. This fits with the backstory of the game really well, with these places being covered in colorless fog. And in the remake, there really is fog all around you. It's not thick enough to be constantly distracting, but it's there and it really adds to this atmosphere of a desolated, forsaken place. The usage of music is also really effective. During the levels there is none, everything that you can hear is the sound of your footsteps, the wails of enemies, the crackling wind. It is very effective in creating tension and a sense of loneliness. It is also very useful for gameplay purposes. For example, whenever you hear a bell of a mind flayer, you instantly get alert in preparation for the upcoming encounter. And while the levels don't have music, as soon as you enter a boss fight, everything changes, and playing orchestra signifies the importance of this event, increasing the tension even more. and then once you defeat the boss, everything becomes silent again. Outside of those moments, the only other music that you hear is a subtle choir when you're in the Nexus, signifying the safety and sort of serenity of this environment, while also having a bit of an uneasy feeling to it as you're actually standing on top of the old one, the very being you're trying to stop. I can't talk about the aesthetics of Demon's Souls without mentioning the haptic feedback possibilities of the PlayStation 5 controller. It's weird, I usually talk about vibration only in relation to gameplay and how it enhances the design of the game, but Demon's Souls actually uses vibration for aesthetic purposes and it's fantastic. For example, Upper Latria is a level that features a giant beating heart. And throughout the level you can feel the heartbeat through your controller, stronger or fainter depending on how far away you are from it. Or for example, there is a particular wall in the game, when you're running on top of it, to your left a dragon can be fighting with Björn. When the dragon roars, your controller vibrates. But because at this moment the dragon is off screen to the left, only the left part of the controller faintly rumbles during the roar that you also hear coming from the left. The amazing part is that there's a lot of things in the game that have some sort of haptic feedback assigned to them, an insane amount really that also includes a lot of player actions. But due to its smart usage and control over the intensity and which parts of the controller rumble and at what cadence, it never feels distracting. And oftentimes the controller haptic feedback is used to greatly enhance the really gritty, crunchy sound effects of Demon's Souls. It is difficult to talk about this without examples, but sadly there is no way I can transmit this through a video, it's really something you have to feel for yourself. I don't think there's much more that I can discuss, really. The voice acting is good, the UI is pretty sleek, and of course the game looks amazing. If one would be the type of person to nitpick, you could say that the quality of lip sync is somewhat lacking, but then again you never really see characters in the game really close for it to become a big issue. If you open up all the scores for aesthetics, I will assign a 10 to Demon's Souls. It looks great, sounds great, and uses everything at its disposal to enhance the atmosphere of the experience. Now it's time to discuss cohesion. This category has a weight of 2 and it's about how well the game connects all of its different aspects together to form a wholesome, holistic experience. Throughout this video you would have heard me both praising and criticizing different aspects of Demon's Souls and how it handles certain things. That said, regardless of what I think about the implementation quality of one aspect or another, what is undeniable is that everything in Demon's Souls exists to serve a purpose greater than the sum of its parts. The best example of this would be the 6th Archstone that can't be accessed. The real life reason why it can't be is of course cut content. But Demon's Souls transformed the act of not having enough time to finish what was originally planned not only into lore, but in UI designed to generate questions and cause feelings. In the context of the game's story, the 6th Archstone was destroyed because the place to the north that it teleported to was the first one to fall to the demons, and its destruction was an attempt to prevent the colorless fog from spreading. However, not only is that broken Archstone present in the Nexus, but it is also in the game's UI, also in a broken state, leaving a gaping hole in the midst of all others. People have been asking for years if there is a way to access the broken Archstone. There is not. When the Demon's Souls remake was announced, there were all these discussions regarding whether the 6th Archstone will be fixed and a new world added. There has not been, and I'm glad there wasn't, because otherwise we would not have this feeling of loss, emptiness, feeling like regardless of what we do, there's going to be some sense of everything being unfinished in a way, and I think that's great. Then of course there's all these ways how Demon's Souls plays with level design to imply a story. For example, when you search for the body of Stockpile Thomas's wife, you find 2 vials of fresh spice. Fresh spice is used to recover mana for magic. So this leads to a connection that Stockpile Thomas's wife was a magician, possibly a witch given that she doesn't wear any church-related robes. That's a little story created right there just by placing a couple inventory items on a dead body. Environmental storytelling is also an important aspect. When you go through Boletaria, you see all the barricades that people were building to combat the demons before they eventually went mad. And I can't help but mention how level design and environmental storytelling also intersect. For example, in Stonefang Tunnel, one of the shortcuts to discover is actually a mechanical vertical conveyor that will be used by the miners to transport goods. It is not just purely a gameplay element that needs to be there, it makes the world feel more realistic. Likewise, the whole circular nature of the Gates of Boletaria level design, the first big map you visit. It makes sense that there is no straightforward path to open the gates, because the walls would have been built in such a way as to make it more difficult for intruders to get in. And for your enemies, you are the intruder now. Prison of Hope has all these floors that have a very similar planning to create this feeling of a massive jail, one that also wouldn't be straightforward to escape from. Many of Demon's Souls' environments are fantastical in nature, but they make sense. There are stories created by visuals as well. For example, the blacksmiths we meet are partially covered in reptilian scales, the one that stayed near Stonefang Tunnel being more affected. These are the same scales one will see on the miners of the tunnel, implying that both Ed and Baldwin were, maybe even still are, in the process of transformation into one of those beings. A pretty sad fate. While I have said it's disappointing that Demon's Souls doesn't do much with this fact in terms of the narrative, the fact that people who consume souls are on their way to becoming demons is still felt through mechanics. When you level up, you become so much more powerful than you were in the beginning, and it's absolutely hard to ignore that. Which creates a huge contrast with the very last boss in the game, the true form of King Aland. Despite all the souls that he has channeled to serve the old one, he is a weak, barely moving, barely resembling a human enemy. After everything that you've gone through in the game, all the deaths, all the losses, there is absolutely no way you can lose to this person. This is just a shell of somebody who maybe has had actual power before, but now can't do anything except illusions. Powerful illusions, but still. It is difficult not to feel some sort of pity for what Aland has transformed into. And that's without even going into a meta layer of the importance of community and working together through messages, online interaction, co-op play, and so on. Even though most of the time you will probably play the game alone, the theme of unity and how it empowers everyone involved can be felt throughout. So if we open up all the possible scores for cohesion, I will definitely assign a 10 to Demon's Souls. The game not only has a purpose for pretty much everything that it has, but also through interplay between different aspects of gameplay, story, and aesthetics, it tries to create feelings and emotions. We get to our final category now, emotions. This is the most subjective category of Stasocritic, as it's all purely about my personal feelings, but it also has the second biggest weight, 3, because personal feelings in the end matter a whole lot. Now, you already know that I have platinumed the game, so obviously that's a sign of great enjoyment. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had 3.5 playthroughs in a row across 2 different characters. So that aspect alone would definitely lead to the game having a 9 assigned for emotions. But did it cause enough feelings that have transcended the gameplay experience to get assigned a 10? Let's find out. Sure, there were some really memorable moments. For example, at one point I helped a person who was doing a pickaxe-based run to kill the Penetrator boss. We then became friends on PlayStation. This is definitely a moment I will obviously never forget. When I was chasing King Gallant with Poison Cloud for the purposes of recording footage, I saw shapes of 3 other players doing literally the same thing at the same time as me. And I couldn't help but laugh, thinking that right now there are at least 4 people chasing the land at the same time. Now, you might remember the footage I've shown where I've killed using Firestorm a Black Phantom who was climbing towards me. What I didn't mention then is that this has happened 3 times in a row, though I recorded only 2. I will never forget this as well. Neither will I forget the moment when during New Game Plus he kept returning to the start of a level to resummon blue phantoms who were helping me and died several times to make sure I was protected. Eventually got to the old hero boss fight and destroyed him, the blue phantoms finally regaining their body form. You might notice a common through line. All moments that have affected me are related to direct interaction with other people playing the game. While I enjoyed Demon's Souls greatly, I haven't been deeply affected by the actual gameplay moments or themes or the story of the game, but the online interactions, even asynchronous ones, those I will hardly forget. Not understanding at first why so many people kill themselves by falling from a big height in the Nexus, then I will do that plenty of times myself. Encountering the first line message, of which there were 2 in a row and both highly rated. I have never felt such betrayal after realizing that all those thousands of players have decided to fool me and many others. And now in retrospect I realize I should have left a message that would warn others to be wary of those lies. Maybe I will return at one point to Demon's Souls just to do that. Or how me and a player who has been summoned to act as the old monk boss couldn't kill one another, even though sometimes both he and I would get some sort of temporary advantage. We both focused on using the shields too much and therefore we had a stalemate that lasted for 15 minutes. And then we somehow managed to communicate through emotes to both not use shields anymore and fight in two-handed mode. And although my playtime through Demon's Souls was pretty recent, memories of failures or successes against different bosses are already fading. But these interactions with different players of Demon's Souls aren't, and these will be stories I may tell to others in the future. And I believe that's enough to bring me over to assigning a 10 to Demon's Souls. Thanks to the multiplayer component of the game, it has been an experience I won't forget anytime soon. Now, let's summarize everything. After taking all scores and their weights into account, Demon's Souls gets a final Stasocritic rating of 89. It truly is a great game, only with some smaller aspects preventing it from becoming fully exemplary in the context of my scoring system, which I might add is not easy. My system is balanced in such a way to avoid inflation of 90 plus scores, so reaching an 89 is impressive. Unless the lack of accessibility options prevents you from doing that, I would really recommend everyone to try out Demon's Souls. I honestly think it has got somewhat of a wrong reputation regarding its difficulty, and there exists some sort of fear preventing people from trying it out. I know it can be argued that back in 2009 there was nothing quite like it and people weren't used to this type of game. And that's sort of true, only I would add that there was nothing popular quite like it in the North American and possibly Western European region at the time, while Eastern Europe didn't have a lack of popular games that wouldn't just lend themselves over to the player. While they didn't have the same exact combination of mechanics, in some ways games like Die by the Sword, Severance and Enclave can be called Souls-likes before Souls-likes existed, and these were really popular in the area I'm from, but they didn't gain traction in America that much. But that's beside the point. I wouldn't say history matters that much in the context of enjoying a game. Ultimately, Demon's Souls is designed to be beaten. It is a game that not only allows you to, it wants you to find ways to make things easy for you. As long as you're careful and observant, you will. And if you embrace the help of the community, you will find those ways even faster. so definitely try the game out. With its multiplayer component, it can be quite a rewarding experience. Thank you all for watching. If you have enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. This helps out a lot in the YouTube algorithm visibility. A special thank you goes to all my patrons. Without their support, I wouldn't be able to make these huge videos properly. Feel free to check out my campaign at patreon.com/Farlands if you're considering to provide your support as well. Thank you very much.